So,
well, one of the other dynamics there that's changed with, kind of the rise of the internet, which for whatever reason has become kind of the centerpiece of this conversation, is the interactivity component, right?
yeah.
So when you were before, as I was talking about previously, watching a television, that was a broadcast model. So there's no real feedback between the viewer or the user in this case and the network that they're really interacting with.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, you can write them
Exactly.
letters or call in or whatever, but that's about it. Whereas now with the internet, there's this two-way loop. And of course, in some cases, you even have individuals just because of their prominence or their ability to attract attention or whatever it may be, who have a significant effect whenever they go on the internet on events in the real world. And if so, there's this, some people feel like, oh, these social media platforms are so powerful, there's so much in control, but ultimately, they're only as good as the users, right? And the critical mass of users that they can attract and maintain and have using their site. But one of the interesting dynamics here that I think about a lot is this concept of hyperreality. I know that you've written a lot on Baudrillard. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And this idea that overall, like, we're getting to a space where this distinction, and it's become especially acute since the lockdowns, as we're all spending more and more time online. This distinction between the virtual and the real is appearing to disintegrate. And of course, anyone who is active on Twitter knows, for example, that there is this weird feedback loop between what I do on the internet and what happens in the real world. And after a while, it does become, especially I'd say if you're a content creator, you've got your newly launched podcast as well. There is this merging over time, whereas most people view a clear distinction between sort of their online life, their social media profiles and their online personas. And okay, here's what I'm doing in the physical world, and that's sort of a very separate thing. Whereas I think, in particular, anyone that's trying to have an effect on the internet, anyone that's doing content production, I mean, this whole conversation that we're having right now is, I guess, technically it's a conversation in meat space, but it's also a conversation over the internet, and it's going to go on the internet. And the reason it happened in the first place is because you and I know each other through the internet. And so there is this strange merging of the real and the virtual that's intensifying, it seems. Do you want to talk about hyperreality and how you view that tying into these ideas?
Sure. So yeah, I think, well, there's so many different angles here. So here's one dimension of it that ties back to a couple of things we've talked about. So are you familiar with this guy Cody Wilson?
No.
He's mainly known as a pioneer of 3D printed guns.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So he was, he had a sort of media splash moment in relation to that and became very controversial. In any case, he had a very weird essay, early on in the pandemic that was all Baudrillard. I mean, he's very influenced by Baudrillard, so that's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down, but I'll try to make it simple. So, what seemed insane. So Baudrillard is best known for this idea the Gulf War has not taken place, right? Which obviously was heavily ridiculed and so on, but I could explain why I think it pretty much made sense. But instead, I'll explain this sort of later variant of it. So Cody Wilson basically argued that what we were seeing with COVID was the sort of apotheosis of this hyperreal simulated reality, right? That Baudrillard had sort of heralded. So this seemed insane, right? Because I mean, come on, this is a real illness that people are literally dying of, and blah blah blah. So this sounds like the Gulf War did not take place, but sort of on steroids, right? But I mean, this argument has been utterly vindicated, I would argue, by the fact that the way that we relate to and experience the virus is entirely through the realm of simulation, right? And that, I would say that is even true if you get it.
How so?
Because first of all, just the experience of getting it is now mediated through your sort of this overlay of political discourse, right? So experiencing having COVID is itself sort of already politicized. I mean, that's not true for everyone.
You could say polluted, and it might be close to the same thing.
Yeah, but here's an example that I think explains this. So a friend of mine who's a medical anthropologist pointed me to this yesterday or the day before. So, people are designing these apps that are like calculators that are supposed to help you determine the risk level of any particular activity you might undertake, right? So this is pure logic of simulation, right? It's basically your life is this point in a kind of, I mean, and the important point to understand about hyperreality is we're not just talking about simulation in the sense of some kind of VR type experience. We're talking about it in the sense of flight simulation. We're talking about it in the sense of missile launch simulation. In other words, in the sense of plotting out points on a sort of mathematical grid, right? And of everything being plugged into this probabilistic calculating system, right? And so this is why part of the point of the important point of hyperreality is not unreal. It's not fakeness or art. It's not artificiality. For Baudrillard, that's actually the earlier phase of the kind of procession of simulacra, right? The third order simulacrum of simulation. The important point of it is not fakeness or counterfeit, right? Which comes from the earlier phase. It's indeterminacy. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you have a mathematical model which is essentially probabilistic, right? And everything is plugged into that model, right? So all of reality is gradually inserted into that model, and so it is radically indeterminate at any point, right? So so this experience you experience the pandemic by and not that necessarily that many people are doing it, but I'd say it's kind of the leading edge of this logic, right? You experience the pandemic by calculating on your phone the risk factor of going to the supermarket, right? And so your experience of just daily activities becomes part of this probabilistic model, right? And everything you do can be understood through that logic, right? And everything that happens can be understood through that logic. I mean, it's even interesting in relation to the ambiguity of these, many people point this out, right? But I mean, it's pretty indeterminate when they say such and such number of people or such and such percentage of the population has had COVID or something like that, right? I mean, the tests themselves are, they're sort of within a range of probability, right? And in fact, like how exactly you process them determines how many false positives or false negatives or whatever you're going to get, right? And so, if you look at the New York Times recently, miraculously the curve starts going down like right after Biden's inauguration, right?
Yeah.
So that just, you look at that and you think, I mean, if you're conspiratorial minded, you think this is just fake. If you're one of those like fake lib pandemic people, right? That's obviously it's just total candy to you. But the point I would make there is that because everything is plugged into these probabilistic models, there is just a fundamental indeterminacy with the kind of reality that's being offered up here, right? That at every point there is an indeterminacy, and so the nature of hyperreality is that you experience that as, in other words, you experience the model, right, as the most real. And so again, what I would say to the sort of what I would say to the sort of Baudrillardian or the sort of Baudrillard scoffers is the point here is not that there isn't a real virus or something like that, right? That would be a very naive and much older version of thinking about simulacra. The point is rather that the reality of the virus inheres in the model, right? That the way that we experience this reality, the way we think it, the way we understand it is entirely mediated through this this kind of modeled simulation, right? And that's it's not that is taking the place of the virus or means that it doesn't exist. It's that's the fundamental substrate of reality as we experience it sort of intuitively, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I would think about that.
So, well, yeah. So there are so many ways I could go with this. One of the things that I wanted to pull on earlier that you talked about was this nature of conspiracy and self-reference. And its relationship to, well, what you're talking about right now, which is simulation, and in particular, people who believe in what's called the simulation theory, that is, that we're living in a simulation.
Yeah.
And there's a particular variant of simulation theory that I find, well, first of all, I would like to say, just because this is my perch and I can say it, simulation theory is very, very close to actual, just straight up theology. And I just find it funny that there's so many atheists who believe in simulation theory. But anyway, outside of that's an outside remark. There's a variant of simulation theory that actually posits this sort of idea that's also kind of popular in kind of like meme space on the internet, which is that there are like sort of real people and that there are kind of like not real people. Mm-hmm. And these not real people NPCs. Are what's called like, the NPCs. Yeah. And so some of us are real characters with like real personalities and real thought, like genuine thoughts. And then some of us are sort of these, I guess, deterministic, machines or something or rather. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Who don't really have real thoughts. They don't have any kind of original thoughts. And like, I guess the way that in which you're one of the real people is that you have stumbled upon this idea. But in particular, like, there's a variant of simulation theory that says that like certain people are special. And the reason that they know they're special is because so many unusual things have happened to them in life that they must be living in some kind of simulation because, how could so many spectacular things be happening? The canonical example, or I guess the exponent of this would be like Elon Musk, right? Who both believes in simulation theory and, as far as I'm aware, believes in this particular variant where part of the reason he believes it is because his life is so strange and so exceptional that there must be like sort of clockwork figures moving the pieces on the chessboard. How do you think of simulation theory in terms of this? We don't have to talk about Elon Musk specifically, although he was on Joe Rogan yesterday, so maybe he's fodder. Anyway.
Well, I mean, I think that's a pretty good illustration of this dominance of this kind of probabilistic thinking, right? Where you assess your life in terms of a probabilistic model, and you say, what's the percentage likelihood that this would happen and this would happen and this would happen, right? If you spread out all of the different possible life courses, right? And in this case, in simulation theory, it would be, well, there are all these multiple different simulations, and in some of them, one set of events is set in motion, and some, so I think the idea there is congruent with the dominance of this kind of probabilistic, sort of model that again, interprets reality in terms of simulated modeling, right? And so in other words, before you even posit the existence of the simulacrum that you're living in, you're already kind of thinking of your life in those terms, right? You're already saying, okay, my life is this kind of series of events that can be understood probabilistically, and for which the odds can be calculated in some sense. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, there's so much historically, both philosophy. I mean, to me, this is both a theme of philosophy and of paranoid schizophrenia, right? Where you have Descartes in Meditations on First Philosophy. I mean, he literally, as he's going through it, he says, one of the things he imagines in his process of systematic doubt is like, I look out at the street and I imagine all these people are automata, right? They're just these kind of clockwork figures, and of course that's also a sort of theme of that period, because you had this obsession with creating clockwork automata. So you have that sort of history. So that's like the NPC, the sort of Cartesian NPC, I guess. And then, I think of Daniel Paul Schreber's term for this is fleetingly improvised men in his memoirs. So the idea is like, basically he thinks like the whole human race has been wiped out except for him. But so when he looks around, he turns over there and like there are some people over there, but his belief is that like before he turned, they weren't even there, right? They were fleetingly improvised.
Schrodinger's cat type situation.
Yeah, but the people were there's this higher force that just like spontaneously put those people there who are not even, who are basically virtual, just in order to make him believe that they were there. So, so obviously this has a long history, but it's interesting to me the way that it's posited today. I mean, because again, I think the Cartesian version would match this kind of earlier model of simulation that Baudrillard identifies, which is the identified with the counterfeit, right? That basically the clockwork automata are sort of counterfeit people. Whereas I think the Muskian example that you just brought up is kind of and the general idea of the world as a sort of video game like simulation where you have these, again, sort of fleetingly improvised NPCs. I think it does fit into this kind of plotting out of the world in terms of sort of mathematical models.
Yeah. Well, certainly you and I must be real, because we're having this conversation.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.